So I'm just going to briefly introduce our speaker and moderator, and then we'll turn it over to Michele. So we have Michele Warman, who is the Executive Vice President, Chief Operating Officer, General Counsel, and Secretary of the Mellon Foundation. And we also have a wonderful moderator, Penelope Brook, who is the Executive Director of the Atlantic Institute. So thank you all for being here, and I will turn it over to Michele.
Michele, should I introduce you?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
You get the double introduction thing. Maybe just a tiny bit of framing before we ask Michele to come and share her experience and ideas with us. As we were preparing for this session, we were very conscious that this forum rightly focuses on colleagues who are standing up for the world through their research, through their writing, through in the way in which they are seeking to understand and interpret and share their own stories and the stories of the past, and how through their stories and their imagination, they're seeking to help us imagine the future and move towards the future we would love to have. And that's, I think both of us feel sort of like a critical thing that's often missing. In this session, we're stepping back a little bit behind the curtain. So we've heard a little bit this morning about the humanities being at risk or being under attack, and the tendency to pull back from support of the humanities. So we're going to pull back the curtain a little bit in this session and look at people and organizations who devote themselves and their work and their lives to being of support to those who are seeking to understand their stories and share their stories and challenge our common imagination, and in particular the world of philanthropy. So it is delightful to have Michele here. She's already been introduced briefly by Sarah, but to help us puzzle through some of these key issues and facilitate a conversation about what it takes or different experiences around trying to be in service of people who are seeking to be of service through the humanities. The Mellon Foundation is about to celebrate its 50th birthday. And I think, Michele, you'll be sharing something with us about its thinking as it moves towards this important milestone. I also understand there's a play with Michele as a key character in it that's about to launch. I will chip in perhaps now and then with a little bit of some of the imaginings from a much younger exercise, the family of Atlantic Fellows, who are also passionate about how we think about changing the world by changing narratives. But Michele, it would be wonderful if you could just begin by sharing with us reflections from your experience around the importance of storytelling, how storytelling shifts the world and the role of supporting that storytelling.
Excellent, happy to do that. Now, I'm a little worried I'm double mic'd now because I'm coming up here. Does this work? It does.
It's magic.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here with Penelope, a fellow Rhodes, doing inspiring work at the Atlantic Institute, leading the Atlantic Institute. Thank you for having me. One of the important questions raised at this gathering of humanists is, how does storytelling impact the humanities? What stories are we or are we not telling? And how do we use stories to deepen our understanding of each other and to improve our lives? Today, I'd like to talk to you about these questions through the lens of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, about why the stories we tell matter, about how the humanities link us together, and about why our work in promoting the humanities should be aimed at and culminate in delivering a more just society. This past summer, it was reported in American newspapers that the photo archive of the Ebony and Jet magazine collection would be going up for auction. Ebony and Jet, if you recall, were the go-to magazines for African Americans beginning in 1945, as the magazines focused, unlike others, on images and stories of African American life. The newspapers revealed that the magazine's more than 4 million prints and negatives, considered the largest collection of photography depicting African American life in the 20th century, would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. This photographic collection is the visual story of the African-American experience in the US over the last 100 years. It contains exclusive images of extraordinary Black leaders and politicians, civil rights icons, musicians, athletes, artists, and activists. Many of the photos were never published, and most have rarely been seen. The president of Chicago's DuSable Museum of African American History called the collection the, quote, essence of the Black story in America. Describing the importance of ebony and jet photography, she said, "We knew we were getting the truth. We knew we weren't getting someone else's version of it." Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Jimi Hendrix, Jesse Norman, and countless other political and cultural icons. The horrifying photos of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old African-American boy who was tortured and brutally murdered while visiting Mississippi. Images first published by Jet magazine in 1955, shocking the world and igniting the civil rights movement. All are in this collection. So when the news broke that this collection would be up for sale to the highest bidder, private or public, the Mellon Foundation, led by our visionary president, Elizabeth Alexander, took swift action. In a matter of hours, really. Rather than allow the collection to go to a private bidder, where it may have remained hidden from history for generations, we would join with other philanthropic organizations, the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, Getty, and later the Smithsonian, to bid for these 4 million images of African American life to secure them in perpetuity. We knew these photos and the stories that they express had to be preserved and studied and protected, and as importantly, made available to a broad public. Why? Because they are central to the American story. They will enhance our understanding of history. The American story would be incomplete without them. I share this story proudly, if you can't tell. As Mellon believes that what and who we memorialize is a statement about the histories that we as a society choose to preserve. And right now, we're not telling stories about everyone or including everyone as we tell history. Here's another recent example of our work. Today in the United States, of 460 national parks and national monuments across the country, only 2 recognize Asian American populations and cultures. 2. And just 8 recognize women. New York City's expansive Central Park, all 840 square acres of it, is getting its first statue of a woman, unless you count the statue of the fictional Alice in Wonderland. Imagine that. Mellon and the Ford Foundation joined forces to help fund Central Park's first acknowledgement of a woman in its history. That was this last docket cycle, actually, in June. And as a foundation devoted to deep and equitable knowledge, we are directing our resources with intentionality to preserving a broad array of histories. To queer history in the South, that was support for a community archive, the papers of Martin Luther King, archives of the icons of modern dance, Bill T. Jones, Merce Cunningham, Martha Graham, and so on. We are paying increasing attention to whose art is getting displayed, whose work is getting performed, and whose leadership is being elevated. We recently supported, and I'll mention this again later, the educational efforts at Bryan Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative. So now a little context about the Mellon Foundation, where I have essentially lived the last 20 years, but happily so. Founded in 1969, so Monday, this day from now, will be our 50th anniversary celebration. The foundation remains one of the largest funders of higher education in America and the largest foundation focused specifically on the arts and humanities. Our mission is, quote, to strengthen, promote, and defend the centrality of the humanities in higher education and the arts to human flourishing and to the well-being of diverse, just, and democratic societies. Again, for further context, as we are lonely in this space, to date, Mellon has made $6.9 billion in grants to institutions of higher education and culture, $2.5 billion in the last 2 decades alone, which is, unfortunately, a drop in the bucket given our vast educational and cultural needs. Private and public support of the arts and humanities, and I heard some statistics earlier today about Great Britain, which I thought was better than the United States, and I'm right, by the way. But in the support of the arts and the humanities in the US is, simply put, pitiful. Just 5% of all of charitable giving supports the arts and humanities, and just 0.008% of the US federal government's budget supports the arts. With its $320 million in annual grant making, Mellon currently gives away more funds to the arts and humanities than the National Endowment of the Arts and the National Endowment of the Humanities combined. And I believe we have someone here from the National Endowment of the Arts, a partner with Mellon, and we are happy you still exist. There, as you, or someone mentioned today, there have been attempts by our current president, still president, to defund both NEA, NEH, IMLS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, basically all of our grantees and partners in the space in the United States. It's horrifying, but they fortunately still exist because there actually was bipartisan support that they continue, that fortunately enough other people in our country do see the relevance of the humanities and the government providing support. So we invest in this amorphous and profoundly meaningful space of the humanities, and we do this work at a time of great change. As the Foundation's president, Elizabeth Alexander, puts it, we must, quote, empower a greater proportion of the populace because a diverse, just, and democratic and informed society is not sustainable when millions of people are disempowered. As a foundation, we can, and again to quote the great Elizabeth Alexander, who I understand was here talking to the Rhodes Scholars, and I hope you enjoyed that and were inspired by her words. She is a poet by profession. In fact, composed and read her poetry at Barack Obama's first inauguration, Praise for the Day. Recommend it if you haven't read it. But to quote her, we can, as a foundation, bring beauty, imagination, and hopefulness to more people through the unique power of art and humanities. Art and humanities can activate people's values, sense of imagination, transformation, and shared humanity. The capacity to make meaning of our humanity and communicate with one another, the capacity to think critically and empathetically and creatively about our lives together, these are eternally important values that the humanities support. And the humanities matter more than ever because at a time of great polarization across America and the globe, we need inspiration and to educate our future leaders. And I know we'll be talking a little more about that too, and I hope we have a good many of them in the room now. We're counting on you. We also know that when we look at higher education, particularly in the United States, but I'm sure here too, in Oxford and elsewhere, the launching ground for many future leaders, those who do the teaching, mentoring, and knowledge creation should reflect the perspectives and talents I will speak about America, of all of America, not just some of it. And yet, at our colleges and universities today, the number of professors from underrepresented groups remains very, very low. In 2015, only 8% of full-time faculty were Black, Latinx, or Native American. The leadership of the academy is even less representative of our population. So one of our major initiatives is the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program, a program, and we have many programs in the area of diversifying the academy and also the arts and cultural institutions. I'm just mentioning one right now. The Mellon Mays program is a program that works to create a more equitable and representative higher education system and diversify the faculty ranks of institutions of higher learning. What stories we are telling indeed matters, but so does who gets to tell and shape those stories and to motivate and inspire our future leaders. Every generation always asks the existential questions about who we are and where we're going. The humanities gives us the ability to explore these questions, and now, more than ever, technology is allowing us to share our stories widely. Digital technologies have transformed how knowledge is organized, preserved, and disseminated. And the Foundation has sought to harness these technologies to capture and distribute scholarship broadly. The Foundation's creation of JSTOR, a digital repository of thousands of scholarly articles, we believe has helped make knowledge slightly more accessible to students and scholars around the world. The support of digital technology has also brought places of historic significance to life and to global audiences. One of the projects we've undertaken in my time at Mellon is supporting the photography and digitization of the intricate wall murals located in the Dunwyn Caves in the Gobi Desert of China. Cave paintings that are of incredible significance to both Buddhist and Chinese history. Historically, Dunwyn was a major stopping point for the caravan trade between China and the West, which moved along what is now called the Silk Road. And sometime between approximately the 5th and 10th centuries, when Buddhist art was introduced to Dunwyn, a great many cave shrines were built there. Extraordinary collections of manuscripts were amassed in what was called the, quote, hidden library, which got its moniker because of the 11th century. In the 11th century, it was walled off to shield its contents from invaders. I must say, partially unsuccessfully. I'll get back to that. Today, the Dunwyn Caves are a World Heritage Site and one of the most extensive records available of the exchange of goods, people, ideas, and languages across the world's largest land mass. And today, you do not need to get a special permit from the Cultural Relics Bureau to view the hidden library, nor do you need to climb a 30-foot rickety ladder with a flashlight in one hand to reach the cave's highest points to see this exquisite art and history. You can get to the Silk Road with an internet connection from your study, whether you're in San Antonio or San Francisco or Oxford. Today, the histories of the East and West are more easily shared, delivered seamlessly to classrooms and libraries throughout the world through high-resolution photographs. But knowledge cannot be knowledge for its own sake. All of this work, embracing a broad and truer range of the multiplicity of stories, making knowledge widely available, supporting emerging and visionary leadership is ultimately about changing lives in order to create a more just world. One last illustration of the work of the humanities. The Foundation, and this is my grant, I have a tiny portfolio myself, and so I'm shamelessly plugging it. The Foundation recently supported a pilot curriculum by the New York Historical Society. The Society had designed an objects-based civics curriculum to prepare immigrants for their naturalization exams. This in response to the current president's abrupt border closings. Called, quote, the Citizen Project, the curriculum drew on the Society's collection of art and historical materials to put US history in context and to encourage the students' critical, interpretive engagement with it. Rote memory, this was not. Participants, for example, examined the draft wheel that survived New York City's violent draft riots of 1863, learning palpably of New York's own complex history. The New York Times reported about the Society's program. One reader was so moved by the story that she called the New York Historical Society and volunteered to officiate at the next naturalization ceremony. It was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the daughter of an immigrant herself. In 1 year alone, the program served nearly 700 immigrants hailing from 75 different countries, speaking 40 different languages. And when Justice Ginsburg swore the new citizens in, there was not a dry eye in the room. They were about to become part of the larger and still evolving American story. Quote, "We are a nation made strong by people like you," Justice Ginsburg told them as they were about to take their oath of citizenship. Quote, "We have made huge progress, but the work of perfection is scarcely done." It is our need to understand our human condition, to share our stories and imagine new possibilities together. That's what makes us fundamentally human. But we also know that humans are imperfect, and we know that our culture and institutions do not reflect the true diversity of lived experiences. Opportunity is not distributed equally. So the work we do in the arts and humanities isn't for critical thought for its own sake, or the ability to answer existential questions compellingly. It's to induce us all to act intentionally and boldly, to make society more just, to move our world forward, to call out inequality and injustice where and when we see it, to build bridges between and among people, and to imagine a world where all people can reach their fullest potential. At Mellon, we know that the arts and humanities have a transformative power, but we have to wield that power with the specific goal of justice and public good to contribute to human flourishing. Because, as Justice Ginsburg said, perfection is scarcely done, and there is indeed more work to do. Thank you so much for this time to share our collective thoughts from the Mellon Foundation and to speak on its behalf, and I'm looking forward to conversation.
Thank you so much, Michele. I had the wonderful chance to begin to get to know Michele just a little bit as we began preparing for this session, and was struck by something which was echoed in your remarks about the lonely work of a philanthropist that is committed to the humanities, both in terms of the world of philanthropy and in the broader world of support for the humanities. And we talked a little about whether I might say a tiny bit about Atlantic's work in this area, and I promise not to take too much airtime with this, but I think so much resonance in the idea in the Atlantic Fellows Project of thinking about a very, very long-term bet on people who will combine many, many stories, many experiences, many insights, to together take on the big problems of the world, and the recognition that, yes, we need doctors and civil servants and neuroscientists and journalists to move ahead, but we also need artists and festival makers and writers and poets and stand-up comics and cooks. And the idea of, in our case, a fellowship that takes a long view and says, this is going to take time. We're going to bet on people for their lifetimes and beyond. Because, yes, perfection is scarcely met, and there is so much work to be done. And I think that there's a lot in common in these efforts, but it still feels like a pretty lonely business in some ways. And wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on something which I confess struggle for any kind of answer myself, which is we have today been talking about systemic change, about work that has a very long arc and is the work of many and joins many different ways of being and storytelling and many different stories. It's not something which has a nice proof of concept in 6 months. It's not a traditional project which yields an early message to a philanthropist of how's this going? Am I having the impact I want? You have 50 years of,
the foundation
you have many fewer years, but the foundation has 50 years and is, as you've shown, we sort of continue rethinking its strategy for doing this. What do you say to others in the field who are wondering about whether and how to get involved, about how to think about entering with confidence into supporting work that is sometimes hard to get your arms around and takes a very long time?
A really good question, and we're still wrestling with that balance ourselves. We have programs, we consider ourselves patient capital that we're investing for the future, and it will take time to change, for example, the academy and representation on faculties. And I'll talk a little more about that example in a moment. But we also are increasingly impatient that we want change now. And so we are really kind of balancing that, trying to, well, this New York Historical Society grant is like instant reward, right? The students engage with collections, they realize American history is not straightforward. They will hopefully contribute to racial understanding, for example. I mentioned the draft riots, that's what it was a race riot, really, in New York. And benefit our country, really, from that learning. And they passed their naturalization exams, and we're all the better for it. So that was a kind of a short-term reward. The Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program is 30 years in the making. And we have now 5,000 students in the pipeline. This is a fellowship that targets underrepresented minorities, mentors them. It also includes individuals with demonstrated commitment to the goals of the program to diversify the faculty and the curriculum. And so we have 5,000 fellows in the program. We have 1,000 that have secured their PhDs. We have 120 tenured faculty members and growing. But this is still a drop in the bucket, right? This is just the beginning, and it takes a long time to affect change here. We also have to put pressures on the universities themselves. Once these students are PhD minted, right? And in every way, both to recognize the essential importance that they be included in the faculty, but then also to give them the opportunity to succeed, because if you're the only, let's face it, like African-American philosopher in a department, the university is going to want you at every single event, public, with the students. Every student is going to want to have you as a mentor, and then how do you publish and not perish, right? How can you be successful when you're alone in this space and feel the moral imperative to use your perch to inspire others? So it is challenging to succeed. We've thought about how does our impatient self accelerate this pipeline? So we have many more institutions involved now participating in the MMUF program. We're being more strategic about where we're running them. So Latinx population, horribly represented in the academy. We're now running MMUF programs in Hispanically serving institutions to maximize the yield. In HBCUs, another example. And And we're trying our best to deploy our allies in the academy. Oh, wow, that went by fast, 20 minutes left, to assist us. So it's a balancing act, frankly, how to do it. Let me just mention another shorter term area that we are new to, and that is education of prisoners. And there's bipartisan support for like ending mass incarceration, partly for the weird reasons of like, it's like not economic, so might as well not build prisons and let people like be employed. And partly for legitimate, in my opinion, social justice reasons that one out of every 3 black man will be incarcerated at some point in his life, that just the targeting of certain people in our population, over half the prisoners in US jails are black. 25% of all incarcerated people in the world are in the United States, that we are just using this as another kind of tool of injustice, frankly. But we're in this space because of the humanity of, the inhumanity of not providing hope, providing poetry, providing performance, allowing the reading of history to, for these individuals, some of whom will never actually leave prison. We're not in the space to decrease recidivism, even though that would be great. We're in the space because these are human beings, and they are just wasting away. And this is new to the Mellon Foundation. Before, we were in the space of, well, higher education institutions should be, understanding criminal injustice, right? Or studying what the plight of prisoners. But now we're in the prisons. So again, this is kind of a long-winded way of answering this question of patient capital. It's going to take forever. We will always be human. We will always be imperfect. There will always be discrimination and unequal opportunity. So how do we begin to redress this and improve our lives? But then also the more immediate worries that we have about just palpable inequality in front of us.
Michele, I'd like to open up for questions, comments. We're going to go one at a time. And why don't we start here, move back to Paul. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 at the back. Is there some kind person with a microphone? There's a... Thank you. I will forget where I said 1, 2, 3, or 4, so I'm counting on you to hang in with me there.
Thank you so much. My name is Dhruva, and I'm a third-year scholar. Are there any grants that the foundation has awarded in its 50-year history that went differently than expected or that you regret making? And how do you learn from your mistakes as an organization? Because I'm sure there have to have been some.
Oh, we've had a number of those. And they're usually expensive mistakes. There's a book written about one of them by my colleague Harriet Zuckerman. She worked on might have been, was easily over a decade initiative to reform graduate education, essentially to accelerate time to degree. And I'm sure any number of people in this room can appreciate the challenge of doing an advanced degree in limited time. And we poured tens of millions of dollars into that effort to get people through higher education faster so that they had experienced less debt. We could get more people educated, and it was a total failure in that respect. It didn't accelerate time to degree. We gave departments money so that the students didn't have to teach undergraduates and so on and so forth, but like life intervened. They had families, they got off on a tangent in some research that they were doing. But what they did find through this study, and it's a 200-page book, so I'm not even going to attempt to analyze it or describe it. But basically, they found that the education itself improved because the spotlight was on each of the academic departments to see exactly what they were doing with these students and how they were supporting their learning and their thinking about what they would do with this learning. We had a big initiative with orchestras years ago where we were going to democratize orchestras, the artist-led, right? The artists' voices and perspectives should be included in the programming of orchestras. I have the former archivist of the New York Philharmonic here, so she will attest that it failed because the boards control the orchestras. The musicians do not have still around most of the country, at least in the States, the ability. It's not a democratic institution, basically, but the idea was to bring more voices to performing, to engage more audiences, to diversify the audiences, to change the programming. Hasn't happened, but we tried, and we will continue. As I said with MMUF, a signature program in the Mellon Foundation, you know, it's a drop in the bucket. And we haven't had takers, other foundations, chipping in to accelerate this work. So, but yes, we learn from this, and we redesign, and we try again.
Thank you very much. I'm Paul Cadero. I guess I'm called a senior scholar. I wanted to get your take on the narrative of philanthropy in 2019. There's a narrative that super rich, or now called the 1%, that is around about them. Whether they perpetrated it or not, the live one's clear. But if you look at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, whose work has been really transformative in the areas they've chosen to support. Right. And the Giving Pledge, and Warren Buffett, and other wealthy people, you know, Jeff Bezos' wife, but he bought a newspaper. So is that philanthropy or not? There are some who would argue that, well, rich people should pay a wealth tax, and then the public good should be, their money should be taken from them, and the Senate and the President of the United States should decide it will be spent on Medicare for all, whether that's a good idea or not. Nonetheless, that's the way we should be squeezing the wealthy rather than let them decide, in the case they wish to do it, of being philanthropic. Now, you are the COO of an organization where the money was earned several generations ago, and you are taking that money and putting it on the scales of social justice and saying, we need to rebalance this. Right. What is your take on the narrative of philanthropy, given that there's huge controversy now about how the wealthy give away their money and how they should be behaving? Right, really important question. Well, first I would answer this question. Well, let me just elaborate on a couple of other attacks. So there is, well, shouldn't the government and the people, I'll say of the United States, get to direct where this money goes? And they vote in and out politicians. There are broader societal needs. Let's take then the humanities, supporting the humanities. There are children starving in New York, right? So that's one attack, and one response, and there are any number of responses to that particular attack is our government doing such a great job distributing the taxpayer money? Is in a democracy, is it good to have other voices, even if the source of the money comes from a single family that was particularly successful, but is deploying a vision and program officers and trying to address areas of need that the U.S. government isn't. Gates Foundation is, very active all over the world. The U.S. hardly is, not in a constructive way these days. And so one question is, what the alternative is if you just plow this money back into the government. There are also questions about, well, even if you have a private foundation, shouldn't we have a say? Some countries do have a say in what counts as charity, right? We just say it has to go to a C3, a not-for-profit organization.
with some public benefit. So Charles Grassley, a Republican senator, who had been chair of the Senate Finance Committee, says, well, he's from rural Iowa. Like, what are you doing for rural America? Who cares about Oxford or Harvard or Princeton and so on? Like, what are you doing to help the people? Well, the Mellon Foundation, we do look across the geography. We do try to maximize impact. We try to be intentional, but we're not predominantly in rural areas. So it's a legitimate question, right? Again, should the government have a greater say in what counts? But then I think the government would probably say, humanities shouldn't be top of the list, right? So again, if we want to have a diversity of funding efforts, there is a real concern about the lack of transparency in the foundation world. I think the foundation world is trying to address that through publishing. We're required by law to publish where our grants go, but to do a better job communicating about how we're making choices and who is getting grants and who isn't. And but there's also this concern about insiders like me enriching themselves. How do we know that they're not using other people's money for their own benefit? So there is actually in America law that has almost a presumption of guilt. It was created in 1969, 50th anniversary, because of some abuses of foundations. And there even have been major foundations, I'll try not to name them, that have had insiders misuse funds. So there's that narrative that's concerning. My view of this, and listen, there are foundations on the left and on the right. We have the Koch brothers doing their thing, and then we have George Soros and Open Society. We have Mellon, I would say, is pretty progressive, Ford Foundation, et cetera. We have foundations of every stripe addressing different areas of concern. I think this is a good thing in our democracy. I think it's enabling, and I think that there is increasing pressure on foundations to make good, to make public good of the funds that they have.
How are we doing for time, Sarah? Two more questions? I know there have been a couple of people waiting, one at the back, and then maybe you can negotiate in the middle of the room.
I'll tell you what, I'll answer succinctly.
Okay,
so everyone can get their
we'll do three with succinct answers. Let's start at the back and move forward. I think, yes, right where you are, yes? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Nana Yatai. I'm not quite sure this is the right forum for this question, but you said, I live and work in Ghana, and you were talking about how there's such a small percentage of money within America that goes towards humanities, philanthropy. In my context where I live, there's an even smaller amount. Hardly any of our government money goes towards the arts or towards humanities. Where there are philanthropists, they're not looking to the arts because of the global imbalance, because of historical imperatives. We're still struggling to build ourselves economically, politically. So a lot of it falls on individuals. You see, I myself am a writer, but I've also had to be an institution builder and an archive builder and build human capital. You see this a lot in our context. One of the things that I try to do, or we try to do, is build like a Pan-African encyclopedia, and our aim at the beginning was we're only going to get money from other African countries and within Africa, so that, because who controls the money, the person controls the narrative. But we found this impossible. And so we did end up, getting funding from organizations like the Open Society Foundation, etc. So my question is, and I'm not sure it's, within your remit, but how, the theme of this talk was narratives of leadership and harnessing our stories for public impact. How do we do that in a world where it's still so imbalanced, where if we do want to impact in a public way and tell our stories, we still do have to go to America for funding? How is that, and I know it's a very big question to ask you, but how does one begin to balance? Because we ask ourselves that question within Ghana all the time. And it would just be interesting to get your point of view on that.
Just to answer, I promise I'd be succinct. So first of all, we make grants in Uganda. And it's in support of the humanities and of master's and doctoral training to create a generation of academics in the humanities that apparently doesn't exist. The support in higher education is so focused on STEM. But we're American, right? So, but we also try, and I know other foundations are doing the same, to create Pan-African networks, to create global networks of scholars. And I think that in other countries in the world, the cult of going back to the question about like private wealth, I think that there will have to be targeting of very wealthy people in those countries too, to own philanthropy. I think that's beginning to happen in China, for example, and it's slowly happening in South Africa, where the United States foundations are still very deeply invested, notwithstanding great wealth in that country that's emerging. So I couldn't agree more about the challenge of philanthropy throughout the world, and we're just doing what we can to try to help jumpstart that. But it is a much larger question.
There were a couple of questions in the middle here. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you for your work today. I am Simone Askew from Magdalen as well. My question is in regards to what you address as like the inclusion or diversification of professors and academics in the academy. And I'm wondering in what ways the Mellon Foundation addresses the foundational injustice of the academy that isn't improved by simply including maybe a woman of color in that space. Because even if you diversify the perpetrators of those unjust systems, it doesn't necessarily change the thematic undertone of the system in and of itself. It just means someone who looks different is maybe oppressing in a similar way. And so I'm curious how the Mellon Foundation addresses that and maybe seeks to destabilize the academy that is built on the premise of exclusion, racial injustice, gender-based injustice, et cetera.
Really good question. And we are thinking a lot about that, particularly with Elizabeth Alexander at the helm, and how to elevate leaders, different kinds of leaders in the academy to change the academy. And it's hard work to get there, right? Because there are power structures in place that are really firmly built. And so we are giving a lot of thought to that. We're thinking about the curriculum. Foundation hadn't before been supporting basically the design of the curriculum, but we will be looking at who's teaching what. Because I think that will empower students also, and it will attract certain faculty members to stay and try to change the academy. This goes back to your initial question about the time it will take really to fundamentally change an institution. I do think it helps to have different people in the institution. That I hope that they bring their life experiences and their passions. We can't test that proposition yet because there is no real critical mass in leadership or in the faculty, frankly. But the Mellon Foundation is concerned about this also with art museums and other kinds of institutions that control the narrative, control the performance on stages, what's on our walls, what's taught in the classroom, who gets in. We're now in the community college space, by the way, to create pipelines in to the elite institutions and leaders that look different than the current student body. So don't have a simple answer other than we're on it. Our new strategic plan, which will be officially rolled out soon, talks about a truer and more complete story and history. It talks about identifying new leaders who will interpret, engage, enliven, and change institutions. It talks about access to knowledge and that it can't just reside in the universities. We're talking about civic space. I mentioned the Equal Justice Initiative. You know, a monument to the legacy of slavery, an opportunity to educate people, like palpably, you know, with their eyes and with their hearts about why it is that there is still inequality in every sense in America. And so we're on it. Stay tuned, and we can use all the help we can get. Part of the reason I'm here is to encourage all of you who are invested in the humanities to come talk with us, think with us, guide us as we really inflect more to thinking and grant making in the social justice space.
I think I'm getting multiple signals here. I'm navigating a space.
I think so. There is a coffee break for 15 minutes. So I think
okay.
if you want to continue this conversation, I want to give you all a chance to get a break if they need to.
Okay.
But maybe we can take the question and continue here very briefly, or in an informal way.
Yeah. Well, might I suggest, if you don't mind, maybe take the question over coffee? And I think, Michele, you left us on a beautiful forward-looking note and with a challenge and a request and a commitment. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing this with us. Thank you all.
Thank you.